Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week, we're going to be talking about personal identity. Okay, so personal identity as a philosophical question mostly has to do with the question, what makes you you? And by that, we don't merely mean the way in which people think about you or the way in which you might conceptualize yourself. Right? You might think like, well, I'm a student, I think I'm relatively kind, fairly intelligent, etc. These are all ways that you could think about yourself, but they're not what makes you you in this deeper sense, right? Here we're interested in what makes you the same person over time. So, what makes you the same person now as you were, say, moments after you were born, right? What makes you the same person all throughout, the same person over time? So it's sort of a metaphysical investigation. It's the nature of self, right? What makes you the same self, right? Okay, so in addressing this question, philosophers often use what we call thought experiments. Thought experiments are just these hypothetical scenarios that we're asked to contemplate in order to provoke some kind of intuition. So it's important to note when we're using thought experiments that we shouldn't try to tweak the parameters of the thought experiment. We shouldn't try to say something like, that's not realistic, and therefore I don't really have to attend to the thought experiment that carefully. Now, try not to change the parameters of the thought experiment. Try to take it as it is. The point is not to suggest that this is the way the world is. The point is to try and get you to think that, well, maybe I do have this particular kind of intuition about what they're trying to get me to think about. Right? So we're going to use a few different thought experiments today. We're going to talk about the ship of Theseus, brain splitting, brain swapping, and most famously, probably, the teletransporter. So we're going to start here with the ship of Theseus. So the ship of Theseus works like this. There's this wooden ship that Theseus and all of his soldiers are using to travel across, say, the Aegean Sea. At some point on the journey, some of the boards begin to rot. So the boards are replaced, right? They're taken off of the ship, and then they are new boards are fastened on. And eventually, the crew arrives at their destination. The question is this: is the ship still the same ship that left the shore? Well, if you think no, because, after all, some of the planks have been replaced. At what point did it stop being the same ship? Was it when the first plank rotted and was replaced? Was it when half of the ship was replaced? It's not clear how you're going to figure that out. Right? It might be that over the course of their journey, they had to replace every single one of the boards. Is it still the same ship? If you think yes, then you need to consider perhaps this further perhaps tweak we can make to the thought experiment, right? Just to push the intuition a little further. Let's say the crew kept all of the old planks. So along the journey, they gradually replaced every single board on the ship. Okay. But they kept all the old ones. And once they arrive at their destination, they reconstruct another ship using that old material in the exact same arrangement that it was in the original ship. Well, if they do that, which of these two ships that are now at the destination, which of them are the ship of Theseus? Is the one made of the old boards the ship of Theseus because it's made out of the old material? Is the newer ship the ship of Theseus because that's how it was treated when it came into shore? Or are they both the ship of Theseus? Can it be in two places at one time? No clear answers yet, but the idea here is to get you to start thinking about personal identity in this respect. In the same way we can think about the ship of Theseus, we can think about ourselves, right? We can think about ourselves. You'll see how very soon. So, what makes you or some particular individual the same person over time? Well, there's one primary division that gets used in the philosophy of personal identity most primarily. This is between psychological continuity views and physical continuity views. So both hold that in some way continuity is important for personal identity, right? There's some kind of ongoing continuity that makes you the same person over time. But how that continuity is supposed to be represented gets debated between these two different parties. First, we're going to look at physical continuity views. So, very roughly speaking, continuity views on the physical side hold that a person remains themselves so long as they maintain the right sort of physical relation to their former selves. In other words, you're the same person you were previously, right? Say when you were 5 years old, so long as you have the right kind of physical continuation between then and now, right? So, why might we think this? Well, all of us have bodies, it seems, right? And our bodies are really the only thing that we can see of one another. I can't see into your mind, for example. I can only see your body. So it's not unusual that we might think that, oh, well, what makes you you is the part that's observable from a third person perspective. It's very clearly, robustly real. And we all have them. Right? So it seems like a pretty good place to start if we're trying to figure out, well, what makes us the same over time. But there's different kinds of bodily continuity that we might be discussing. First, there's brute identity. Brute identity holds that you're the same person so long as you have identical bodies. Right? You're the same person so long as your bodies are identical. Now, you might like this kind of view if you thought that as soon as they removed one plank from the ship of Theseus, it was no longer the ship of Theseus, right? Any physical change at all, you're not the same, right? One board gone, not the ship of Theseus. Lose some kind of piece of you physically, no longer the same person. So the advantage of brute identity theory is it's very easy to understand, right? We can clearly understand what the conditions are for whether you're the same or not. It seems pretty straightforward. But there are some pretty significant problems for the view as well. Primarily, like the ship of Theseus, our parts get replaced all the time. In fact, all of our parts seem to get replaced at some point or other. Our cells, all of them, seem to die and give way to new ones. So if brute identity theory is true, if brute identity is true of personal identity, well then we die all the time, right? As soon as, I cut my fingernails or one of my skin cells dies and is replaced by another, I'm not the same person anymore. I'm not the same person anymore, therefore that former me is gone, is perished. I am totally a new person, right? That seems pretty hard to swallow. It's not the case that it couldn't be true. It's just not how we typically think about personal identity. And I think I'm more or less the same person I was at least 5 minutes ago, surely. 10 years ago, maybe not so much, or not to the same degree, but 5 minutes ago, definitely. Even though I cut my nails, right? There are some more sophisticated varieties of physical continuity views. So you could have something like a proportional identity view. This says, instead of saying you have to have all physical parts of you identical, you just need to have enough. There's a certain kind of proportion of you that needs to remain the same in order for you to maintain some kind of identity, right? So you're the same person despite all of these little changes, because some proportion of your cells are still the same. So the difficulty here is that it's going to be very difficult to decide exactly what proportion is necessary to maintain identity. Is it 20%? I need to be 20% the same? Is it 21%? Is it 50%? It's not clear how we're supposed to decide that. And because of that, it seems like the view runs into the objection that it is ad hoc, that it is created merely for the purpose of having an answer, not because there's any real reason to think this is the case. Further, we know that all of our cells eventually undergo replacement, which means this: it's going to be the case that at some point, even for the proportional identity view, you're not going to be the same person anymore, right? You're not going to be the same person anymore. It's also possible, in order to account for this kind of problem, that the proportional identity theorists could say, oh, well, we're talking about proportionality over time, right? So long as you are, say, whatever percent the same as you were a few minutes ago, you're still the same person, even though you're not the same percent identical to the person 10 years ago, right? We're only indexing you in a sort of leapfrog way to certain points in time, right? But that too runs into this potential ad hoc objection. Both of these views can be more sophisticated and they can be made about the brain, right? A lot of people, as we've seen, now having done our philosophy of mind unit, really think we should be thinking about the mind and ourselves in some way identical or having to do especially with the brain. So you might want to say, well, what's necessary to maintain your identity isn't like your fingernails or anything like that. Of course, losing a fingernail doesn't mean you're going to be a different person. It has to do with the brain. So you might be a brute identity. You might have a brute identity view that just involves the brain. You might say you're the same person over time, so long as nothing in your brain has changed. Well, obviously, that's going to have problems too, right? We do replace neurons, we do replace glial cells all the time. So the brute identity view is still going to say, ultimately, you're dying and being reborn constantly as a new person. It's also the case that our brains undergo transformations in their functioning, right? So in order for the brain to function, things are happening, things are changing. You're not identical. Otherwise, you'd be static, right? So it doesn't seem like brute identity theory is really going to work for us here. But you might also be a proportional identity theorist where the brain is concerned. So you could say something like, you're identical to some former self so long as you are sufficiently similar, right? There's a sufficient proportion of your brain that is similar to that brain back then, right? Might not have as many problems as a proportional view that just talks about the body at large, but is still going to run into some of the problems again. How are we to decide what percentage of the brain is necessary, for example, without it being ad hoc? Do some regions of the brain matter more than others? There's a lot of work to be done to motivate this kind of position. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It could be the case that we do die and are reborn all the time. It could be the case that the brute identity view is true. It's just that they're going to have certain kinds of challenges, right? They're going to need to at least explain why our perception that I'm the same person, at least as I was 10 minutes ago, is false, right? They're going to need to explain why I have that feeling, even though it's false. Okay, so because our bodies change so frequently, physical continuity views have largely fallen out of favor, right? Today, most philosophers are or find themselves situated somewhere within a psychological continuity view. So the idea here is that so long as you have a certain kind of psychological relationship to a past version of yourself, then you're still identical with that past version. Now, how this psychological continuity gets cashed out can come in many different kinds of flavors. So first off, we'll talk about the simple view. The simple view is simple, as it suggests, not because it's easier to be true. In fact, I think that's very obviously not the case, but because it's easier to understand. More or less, it goes like this. You are the same person so long as you have the same soul, right? So it doesn't matter if your body undergoes any changes. So long as you have the same soul, you're the same person. So typically this view is attractive to like substance dualists who think of the mind as something altogether immaterial that's merely like attached in some way to a body, or people who belong to particular religious traditions that think that we are more or less like machines, like flesh machines inhabited by some kind of soul, something like that, right? So personal identity then for these people is bound up entirely in the immaterial. It's entirely in the soul or something like it. So the advantage of this view is that because it's not a physical thing at all, right? The soul or the immaterial mind, we don't have to suppose that it changes all the time, right? We don't have to think of it as this entity that's in constant flux. It's not losing cells and regaining them all the time, right? So it seems to allow for our intuition that I'm the same person over time to be maintained. So that seems like a positive feature of it. Still, it does seem like, at the very least, our minds change all the time. So for the substance dualist, this might not be an easy way out, right? Nevertheless, it does have that particular advantage. Okay, the problem with it obviously has to do with the fact that it's going to be very difficult to defend. If you do not already believe this, it's going to be very difficult to convince you of it. Why? Because it's not like I can demonstrate it to you. I can't point to it and show you, look, you have this immaterial aspect. Because I can only point to physical things. I can only point to material things. So I can't convince you to be, let's say, a substance dualist by pointing to your immaterial mind. It's not a thing that I can do. And therefore, it's going to be really difficult to defend this view. You kind of already have to have it going in the background in order for it to be convincing. But there are other kinds of psychological continuity views that don't require us to defend anything like a soul or an immaterial mind. First, and very popular, at least for a time, is John Locke's memory continuity view. So the idea is this: you get to be the same person over time so long as you have the same memories. So long as you have the same memories, you're the same person. So this also avoids the kind of problems we were seeing with physical continuity, right? That, well, we lose bits of ourselves all the time physically, and therefore we would be dying all the time, right? It doesn't have that worry. Yeah, we do occasionally lose memories, but far less frequently than we do cells and things like that. Also, it doesn't seem like, except for very rare cases, that we would lose all of our memories. Whereas we know that eventually all of our cells are going to be replaced, right? So it seems like it avoids many of those physical continuity view problems. But it has problems of its own. It has some unique problems. So the first problem has to do with the transitivity of identity, right? So philosophically and more at large, right, even mathematically, we regard identity to be transitive. What that means is that if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A should also be identical to C. And we think of identity as holding that kind of property. So for example, Superman is supposed to be identical to Clark Kent, right? And Clark Kent is identical to Kal-El, right? That's Superman's alien name, if you don't know, if you're not nerdy enough to know. Therefore, by transitivity, Superman is supposed to be identical to Kal-El. Yeah, that's how it works. That's how it's supposed to be. But memory doesn't always work that way. For example, we can imagine someone who remembers her 5th birthday party when she's 20 years old, and she can remember her 20th birthday party when she's 40 years old. But at 40 years old, she's not able to remember her 5th birthday party. That means that when she's 20 years old, she's still the same person as she was when she was 5. And when she's 40 years old, she's still the same person as she was when she was 20. But it's no longer true that now that she's 40 years old, she's the same person that she was at 5. Why? Because she's lost those memories. That doesn't seem right. Identity is supposed to be transitive. If she was identical to her 20-year-old self, she should also be identical to her 5-year-old self, right? So this doesn't seem to work. it seems like the personal identity through memory view can't really sustain the transitive nature of identity. Okay. There are a couple other ways in which you could try to get at psychological continuity. One is to say that it has to do with a kind of causal connectedness, right? That you are identical to your formal self, your former, this should say, your former self, so long as our psychological lives are still causally connected to our former psychological lives. So even if you forget your fifth birthday party, for example, when you're 40 years old, you're still the same you because the psychological happenings of the 5-year-old have had some kind of cause and effect chain, right? There's some kind of causal chain that has, in some way, to some degree, caused what you're currently thinking, that have caused your current psychological happenings. So once again, when you're 40 years old, your current psychological happenings are to some degree, maybe not significant, but to some degree, caused by a long chain of cause and effect that we can trace back to when you were 5. So it has to do with there being this causal connectedness that makes you the same person over time. That sounds pretty reasonable until we get a little weird with thought experiments. Okay, so now we're about to jump into the kind of strange territory that you have to get to when you have a philosophical conversation about personal identity. First up, let's talk about brain swapping and splitting, right? So philosophers within discussions of personal identity love talking about what happens when we mess around with people's brains and bodies. So in a brain swapping case, we imagine that you and some other person undergo this procedure that swaps your brains. That is, your bodies are put on tables and your brains are taken out of your bodies and swapped. So the question is, which person is you? Is it the one that has the brain in it? Or is it the one that has the body that you identify with? Well, if the psychological connectedness view is true, then it seems like the person with your brain is going to be you, right? After all, unless you're some kind of substance dualist or someone like that, it seems like the brain is at least important in some way to who you are, where thinking is concerned, right? Who you are psychologically. Therefore, it would seem like you are in this stranger's body. You're in a stranger's body, but your identity goes with the brain. The problem is that from an outsider's point of view, it's going to seem the opposite, right? It's going to seem as though you are the body, right? The body that you identify with. Okay, so there's going to be this mismatch between what you feel and what the world feels. It could be that that's just kind of a quirky consequence, but not really a threat to the view of psychological connectedness. Okay, sure, the world is going to misidentify me as being in that body versus this one. Yeah, that's kind of weird, but that doesn't mean that psychological connectedness view is wrong. So now we introduce brain splitting cases. So in brain splitting cases, we're asked to imagine that you have your brain once again extracted from your body and split in two. One body gets one half of your brain, and another body gets the other half. And let's say that both of these hemispheres are capable of living full psychological lives. And that does seem to be the case empirically. Not all the time, but at least sometimes, as a matter of fact, humans can survive with only half of their brain. So it's not as outlandish as you might think it is. But if we can do this, what happens? Where are you? It's your brain, just your brain, no one else's, that has been split into body A and body B. Are you now in body A? Or are you in body B? It was easy to answer when we were considering brain swapping. Oh, well, I'm wherever my brain went. But now your brain is in two different bodies. So what has become of you? Well, it could be that there is no you anymore. That's possible. It could be that there are two different people, but it could also be that you are in two different places now, that you're in two different places. We call that idea fission, right? So is fission possible? If you say no, then psychological connectedness can't work. Why? Because both of those brains, if they're capable, both of those hemispheres, if they're capable of having full psychological lives, well, it is true that they have a psychological causal connectedness to you however long ago, right? Both of them have that same relationship. And so, by the view of psychological connectedness, they ought to both be you. But can you be in more than one place at once? It's not clear. So, one problem that nearly all psychological continuity views have is that it seems like there are times when we fall out of conceivable continuity. This might also, like looking out of brain swapping and splitting cases now, it might occur very frequently. So, for example, you fall unconscious when you sleep, for example, all of the time, and you have no particular psychological goings on. If that's the case, by most psychological continuity views, at that point you might cease to be. Now, there are some psychological continuity views that have an easier time with this particular objection, like the memory view, for example. If you wake up and you have the same memories, it doesn't really matter that you stopped existing for some time, right? So long as you have the same memories as you did back then, you're still the same person. Identity doesn't have to be a continuous thing. But if you hold a view like psychological continuity, wherein it's about me having a continuous chain of experiences, then that's going to be a more significant problem. Okay, so all of these views seem to have problems then. Which one is the best? How are we supposed to choose? It's not immediately clear how, but we can look at the teletransporter thought experiment to try and get our intuitions pointing in one direction or the other. Okay, so the teletransporter is this device, right? This device allows you to teleport nearly instantaneously. So you can travel vast distances, let's say across the solar system, nearly instantaneously. Here's how it works. You step into the booth, this computer scans you down to every single molecule. Then it recreates you on the other side out of matter perfectly. No errors ever, while simultaneously destroying the you who entered into the booth, right? So the you that walked in gets destroyed after it's been scanned, while the one at your destination is created perfectly, molecule by molecule. The you that steps out on the other side is physically identical to you. It thinks the same way you did. It has all the same memories. Would you then take the teletransporter? Do you think it's safe? Well, some people think that stepping into the teletransporter means death. They think that, if you step into the teletransporter and it destroys you, no matter how perfectly you're recreated on the other side, you've died. That's not you. You've died. If you think that that's true, then you are probably not a proponent of the physical continuity view. Why? Well, because on the other side, you're physically identical, right? You are exactly the same. We could even imagine that the teletransporter, in some way, rebuilds you out of the exact same molecules. So it's not just that it gets the pattern perfect, it's that it uses the exact same molecules to recreate you. If you still think, no, stepping into the teletransporter means death, you definitely don't hold a physical continuity view. Okay? There's no physical difference on the other side. You should have survived if you have a physical continuity view. But what about psychological continuity views? Well, if you're some kind of physicalist where the philosophy of mind is concerned, like you go in for identity theory, for example, then you might still be comfortable taking the teletransporter. Because after all, what controls your psychological life just is like the brain, right? So if it's recreated perfectly, well, you ought to be fine. You ought to be fine. Um, if you're a physicalist, having the same brain as someone entails that you'll have the same memories, thoughts, and beliefs as them. So for the psychological continuity view, you survive the trip if physicalism is true. Substance dualists, on the other hand, might think that you've died. Why? Because the new you that's created is not instilled with the same kind of immaterial aspect. It's not given this soul or immaterial mind attached to it in the same way that your other body was. Right? This can get more complicated for views like substance dualism. They might want to say, for example, oh, well, merely being physically destroyed doesn't eliminate my identity. My identity goes wherever my immaterial self goes. And therefore, you have destroyed my physical body. My body is gone. But I still exist. This is more common for the simple view that we've discussed, right? You might think, for example, if you step into the teletransporter, your body is dead, but your soul lives on. Nevertheless, you're going to likely agree that whatever steps out of the teletransporter on the other side is not you. Okay, so teletransporters can get even weirder, right? Let's think of this further case. Let's say that you are deciding to take the teletransporter. You step in, right? You think it's safe, but you've been talking with your substance dualist friend who's been trying to convince you, like, look, don't do it. Don't do it. You're going to be destroyed, at least physically. You shouldn't do it. And you can't get their warnings out of your head. So at the last second, after the computer scans you, you jump off the teletransporter, right? You get out of the booth. Well, what would happen if, because it's already scanned you, it still perfectly recreates you at the destination? Well, now there's a perfect physical replica of you on the other side, but you are still there. You haven't been destroyed by the booth because you left. So the question then is how many of you are there, right? How many of you are there? If you think there are multiple of you, then clearly what you think is required in order for identity to be maintained is just a kind of physical existence, right? It just has to do with something physical. That could either be some kind of physical continuity view, or it could be a psychological continuity view if you hold something like identity theory to be true. Okay, finally, wrapping up here, you could have a view of personal identity that goes totally against everything we've seen thus far. You might, for example, think that there really is no such thing as self at all. That in fact, this idea of there being this individual that I am, that there is some me that extends over time, is just an illusion, right? There are some philosophers who hold that this is true. Derek Parfit is one. More historically, David Hume, right? David Hume suggests that really, at the end of the day, we're just bundles of experiences. In other words, we're just a bunch of experiences going by in like a slideshow, right? Experience, experience, experience. But there's nothing to suggest that there's anything more than that slideshow of experiences. This might all seem strange, but it's very common amongst non-Western schools of thought, right? For example, in Buddhism, Hinduism, it just is the case that this sort of individual sense of yourself is ultimately illusory. The whole point of trying to achieve enlightenment or nirvana is to realize that truth and to rejoin the whole, right? To sort of escape from this illusion of self. So it's not all that uncommon. Billions of people purportedly think it, right? Okay, so looking forward then, now that we've kind of got an idea of what positions are out there for personal identity, where can we go from here if we're trying to understand what makes us who we are? Well, in some respect, The way other people think of you makes you who you are. Right? The way the world sees you, the way that you are classified by the world, in some way has a great impact on who you are. Right? So we might have some kind of idea now what makes us the same over time. But we haven't yet touched on what makes us who we are. So next week, we're going to take a very brief look into the philosophy of race and the philosophy of gender, two categories that largely affect who we are in at least the kind of world that we live in today. But until then, stay healthy, stay safe.